Before the universe existed, there was Anu. This was the unchanging stasis. And into the stasis came Padomai, the agent of change that created the universe. From the chaos of creation came the Atada. These formless spiritual beings populated the universe. And of all of these beings, then came Akatosh. He was the first to acquire form and identity, and he was the first to bring the concept of time into the Elder Scrolls universe. This was the beginning of time in the story and in the game. In this series, we're going to explore various scientific concepts in the Elder Scrolls universe, and even though it may go against the logic of the game, we're going to ignore the magic, we're going to ignore the myth, and we're going to focus only on the science as we know it today. We are going to try to recreate the entire solar system and the entire universe in the Elder Scrolls as it's known to the characters in the game, and use various games including Universe Sandbox 2 to explore the planets, the stars, and the entire universe of this beautiful series of games. Welcome to What the Math, and I hope you learned something new from this video. Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, Khajiits, Nords, Elves, Redguards, and other races I don't really remember anymore. Welcome to What the Math. In today's video, we're going to be recreating the Elder Scrolls universe using Universe Sandbox 2, and this is actually part 3, where I'm going to show you yet another recreation of the cosmological knowledge that the characters in Elder Scrolls universe have about their own world, and we're going to be using slightly different approach this time, actually a little bit more scientific than before, and we're also going to be using this beautiful picture I found that was made by a person. I believe his name is Okir or Okair, and he created this really awesome representation of the entire universe from the Elder Scrolls. But the reason why I'm actually in this particular simulation is because we're going to be using a scientific concept I recently discussed in one of my videos called Lagrange points. Now, these two space stations are in Lagrange L1 points of the moon. And what this means is that they're going to stay in this particular position while the moon is orbiting the Earth, and you'll notice that they actually stay in here quite a long time before they actually start escaping and before things go wrong. Now, just remember what these are, and I'm going to show you. Here's a picture actually of what Lagrange points look like in between two objects. And now, if you don't really know what I'm talking about, you may want to take a look at the video I made previously where I explained this in more detail. But these are the important concepts to know for this particular video, because we're going to be using them to try to recreate the universe, or the cosmological map of the Elder Scrolls universe that we find in Dwemer Orrary in Redguard Adventures, one of the previous games that was released a long time ago, that actually had an actual recreation of all of the planets and all of the other objects in Elder Scrolls. Anyway, so what we're going to do is let's actually just accelerate this a little bit more, that just so you see that these two objects, even though they're orbiting the moon, they actually stay in this particular point indefinitely. So just remember, this is called L1 Lagrange point. We're going to create a new simulation, and right in the middle of the simulation, we're going to place our star, and this is of course going to be our star called Magnus. Now, Magnus is the star in Elder Scrolls, and right around this star, we're going to place our planet called Nirn. Now, this is where all of the mortals live. This is where all of the things happen in Elder Scrolls. And this is Nirn as it's going to look like in this particular game. So this is where you start all of the games, including Daggerfall, Morrowind, Oblivion, Skyrim, and of course Elder Scrolls Online. They all start somewhere on this continent. Actually, Elder Scrolls Online may actually start somewhere else, but that's another story. Anyway, so this is the main continent, including Tamriel, and we're going to be using this as a center of our creation. Now, in one of the previous videos, we actually tried to recreate this using the Nirn-centric approach, where things were orbiting around Nirn as they appear in Dwemer Orrary, but in the second part, I actually showed you what it would look like if this was a Magnus-centric universe, if things were orbiting around the sun and looked a little bit different. But today we're going to do something in between. So, like I mentioned before, there are these points called Lagrange points, and there's one right here-ish, and there's one right here-ish. These are called L1 and L2. Now, these points are created because the interaction of gravity between Nern and Magnus creates this point of balance right in between them and also slightly behind Nern, where you can actually place an object and it will stay there indefinitely, and it can even orbit an imaginary point, creating something called Le Séjour orbit. Now, these orbits are very important because a lot of these satellites we have on our planet Earth are actually in that particular location, orbiting in this imaginary point and then looking at Earth indefinitely. The reason I'm saying this is because if you actually look at this picture again, this is actually the recreation from a website, I believe, called Dwemer Studies, and they've recreated this picture of Dwemer Orrary. You'll notice that there's an orbit, it almost looks like it's below Nern, and an orbit that looks like it's above Nern, and this is where some of these planets orbit. Now, these are obviously planes of existence. They're not really planets in the Elder Scrolls universe, but in this series, I've committed myself to recreating this scientifically and ignoring the magic, ignoring the mythology, and just focusing on the science. And I think one of the ways we can recreate all of this is by placing some of these planets in L1 Le Séjour orbit, and some of these planets in L2 Le Séjour orbit, and then some of these other planets like Akatosh will be actually orbiting Nern. In other words, they are technically not planets, they're actually moons. But before we do that, let's actually talk a little bit more about other objects. So there's also 16 other objects here in this particular universe called the Daedric planes, or I guess you could call them planes of Daedra, that are actually located somewhere on the on the outskirts, called basically it's kind of like space area called Oblivion. Now, everything in the middle, I'm just going to use just a kind of a circle to show you. Everything in the middle where all of the main bodies are, including Xanatar, Akatosh, Mara, Dibella, Nern, and so on. All of these are called, or they're actually located in the area called Mundus. Now, Mundus is, here's a picture of it. This is what it looks like. It's sort of like the central area, but right after it, in between Mundus and something called Asterius, there is something called Oblivion. Now, we can refer to it as open space, we can refer to it as outer solar system, but essentially this is where the 16 objects known as planes of Daedra are located. And in the Elder Scrolls series, these are actually they're kind of like dimensions. You go to them using portals in the game called Oblivion, or you can actually see these portals and monsters appearing from those portals in Elder Scrolls Online. But we are going to use science today, and we're going to assume that these are actual planets. Now, some of these planets might be actually closer to the sun, which is why they're hot, and some of these planets might be away from, I should be calling the sun, from Magnus, and these are obviously cold. Now, I've tried to go through all 16 and see which ones were hot, which ones were cold, and some of them I couldn't really figure out, but we're going to place all of the hot ones closer to Magnus and all of the cold ones farther away. So let's start with number 1. And the first object I've decided to place closer to the sun is called Deadlands. Now, this is the plane of existence for Merunus Dagon. He is one of the Daedra, and his entire world, and you actually get to visit that in Oblivion if you ever play that game. It kind of looks like, you know, a lava planet, essentially, and everything is really hot here. This is a planet that has 1,000 degrees Celsius temperature, and I think this is a pretty good representation of his home world that you get to visit in Oblivion. Now, this is obviously a planet that is really close to the star. The second planet here, or the second plane of Oblivion, is called Attributions Shared. Now, this is a plane for a Daedra called Boethia, and it's also a very hot planet, but I wasn't sure if there was any lava on it because we don't really get to visit it. We just know that it's very hot and that it does have a lot of fire on it. The third planet here is called Apocrypha, and this is the world for Hermaeus Mora. Now, this planet is, or I guess this plane is essentially a very toxic world, which is why I kind of like this blue part here, because this is kind of what you get to see. There's a lot of blue, there's a lot of green in this particular plane, and I believe you get to visit this in Skyrim, if I'm not wrong. And if I am wrong, please correct me in the comments below, but it's a very kind of a dangerous and toxic world where there's a lot of poisons, there's a lot of things that can kill you. Then we have another planet called Ashpit, and this is the place of origin for Malakath, and he is a Daedric prince of ash, or I guess he has a lot of ash, or he likes ash, because this is essentially an ash planet, and it's relatively close to the star as well, which is why it's very dry and very ashy. And I really like this Martian look that it has, because I think this kind of gives it a very ashy look, similar to, I guess, how Mars looks like to us from a distance as well. And another hot planet we have here is called the Pits, and this is the world for Periite, and Periite often appears as a dragon, and we don't really know much about it, except for the fact that, you know, he likes to appear as a dragon. So I figured, you know, he probably lives in a somewhat warm-ish environment, which is why he gets another lava planet. But it was very interesting that, unfortunately, there was very little information about Periite otherwise. So we don't really know much about the plane of existence for Periite, other than it's called the Pits. So these are the 5 relatively hot, relatively warm objects that I was able to find. Then we also have a few planes of existence that are actually almost idyllic. A lot of them have woodlands, a lot of them have a lot of beauty, like for example Azura's plane of existence called Moonshadow is a very dreamy, very beautiful environment. So I figured there must be somewhere within the habitable zone of the star, and the habitable zone here would be in the green part. So somewhere in here we'll have to place the other planets that actually have relatively good climate environments and actually have life on them that is not super deadly and super scary. And here are our 3 planes of existence for 3 more Daedra, and the first one is called Moonshadow. This is the land or the world of Azura, the infamous Daedra that you get to see in many Elder Scrolls games. Then we have the Hunting Grounds, and this is the world for Hircine, yet another Daedric lord. And finally we have Shivering Isles, and this kind of looks like isles. You can kind of see it from the top here, and this is where Sheogorath lives, and you get to actually meet him in person in Daggerfall if you ever play that game. He's a pretty crazy person, or I guess Daedric prince, that does do a lot of really interesting and unusual things. And so we're only halfway done here, and we have 3 of them in the habitable zone and 5 that are too close to the star. That makes them super hot, and we need to put 8 more, and I think the other 8 have to be past the habitable zone in a cold and dark region of space, because this is actually what a lot of these other planes are like. So for example, we have a dark world called Spiral Skyne, and this is a world for Mephala. And the only thing I could find about it is that it's actually relatively dark and relatively cold. Then we have a world called Colored Rooms. Now, it's a very colorful world, and it's a very mysterious, very hazy world of a Daedra called Meridia. And it is a very cold world, which is why the temperature here is at minus 106 degrees Celsius. A little bit too cold for comfort, but we can always increase that by adding a little bit of temperature. Or if we just add a little bit of atmosphere, it gives it even more haze and will obviously increase the temperature as well. So its temperature now is at minus 30 degrees due to, of course, greenhouse effect. And so this is what it looks like right here on this mysterious, beautiful plane of existence for Meridia. Then we have this super cold world called Cold Harbor, and this is a world for Molak Bal. You do get to meet this Daedra, and you also get to explore this world as well, and I believe it even appears in Elder Scrolls Online. And as you can see here, it's basically all cold and icy region in space. Another dark and somewhat cold world is called Scuttling Void, and this is where Daedric Prince Namira lives, and this world is also very dark, and this world is also very cold. And another really dark world is called Evergloam. Now this one is also kind of dusky and mysterious, and this is where the Daedric Prince Nocturnal lives. Nocturnal actually does appear in many games as well, and you can even summon him in various games to help you on your quest. And lastly, the last cold world is called Quagmire, and this is where Vermina lives. And so this world is a little bit darker, a little bit more unfriendly looking, and its atmosphere gives it this kind of a mysterious haze as well. Now, we're still missing two more planes of Daedra, and that's because I wasn't really sure where to place them. So there's one called Sanguine's realm, and this is a realm that's very, very red. Now, it doesn't really mean that it's hot, but it's possible that it is hot, so we might actually have to place it somewhere in between Nirn and the other objects in the region right here, in the red region. So let's just place it right here. And so this is what Sanguine's realm looks like. It's a little bit more orangey than red, I guess, but it is a world where Sanguine lives, and basically this is where he resides and governs his Daedra. Then we have last world called Clavicus Vile's realm, and this one I really couldn't find much about, and we're just going to place it where there's space, which is going to be right here. And I'm not sure what's on it and what exactly it has and what it looks like, because we don't get to visit this realm anywhere. But this is what Clavicus Vile's realm is going to look like in Universe Sandbox 2, and this is of course where Clavicus Vile resides and governs his world. And so this is what these 16 planes of Daedra look like orbiting around Magnus. And this is, I think, a pretty good representation of what the universe might look like in Elder Scrolls. But before we actually continue talking about Nirn and recreating the other planets, let's briefly talk about what these Daedra are. So in general, Daedra refer to supernatural creatures, and mostly in most of the games you see Daedra attacking you because they are actually supernatural creatures that have minimal intelligence. They're sort of comparable to animals on our planet, or I guess on Nirn as well. And these animals will often attack you, but they are not actually so they represent the original plane they're from, but they're not actually Daedric princes, because Daedric princes are a much smaller subset of powerful creatures, essentially godlike creatures that govern each of these planets. So there's 16 of them in total, and each of them have their own sort of element or representation or something that they really love and admire. And for each of these princes, there is something that you can use to summon them as well. And these 16 Daedric princes were there from the beginning when the realms were created. And unlike the Daedra that actually sacrificed themselves to create either Nirn or planets that we'll be creating in a second that orbit around Nirn, the Daedric princes chose to maintain and keep their power and instead started their own worlds. And so these 16 actually still have their full power, and many of the mortals that live on Nirn that actually desire power or desire money or whatever that it is that they desire, they often pray to or summon Daedric princes to try to ask for their favor. And so these are kind of like you can call them evil spirits, or sometimes they're actually not so evil, but they're the powerful spirits that can then manifest themselves on Nirn and grant certain favors to mortals. But these are technically evil spirits, and because we also have the other spirits called Daedra that created various planes or planets that orbit Nirn. So we're going to recreate these right now using Lagrange points and using everything else that we know about Nirn. So firstly, let's create its moons. And the moons of Nirn are Masser and Secunda actually orbits Masser while Masser orbits Nirn. So these are the first two objects we have here. Then we also have several other objects orbiting around Nirn, and these are obviously technically moons now and not really planets. But we have Kinnereth right here. We also have Akatosh, the biggest of the planes right here, and it actually does orbit Nirn, even though it's not showing in this particular game. If I were to just put trails, you'd see that eventually we'll actually start orbiting Nirn. Then we have Julianos and its own moon called Standar. And these are the four objects that actually do orbit around Nirn according to Dwemer Orrary. Then, if we were to go to the L1 Lagrange point, which is obviously the point between Magnus and Nirn, and this is, in this particular simulation, it's about 1.5 million kilometers away from Nirn toward Magnus, and so I'm going to try to find that point right here. And there it is, somewhere right about here. This is about 1.5 million kilometers. We're going to rename this and name this Arkai. So Arkai right now is technically in the L1 point, Lagrange point, in between Nirn, which is right there, and Magnus, which is right there. So if everything goes well and if we get really lucky, it will start orbiting around this imaginary point called L1 point, and it will start orbiting in what's called a Le Siju orbit. This orbit is what we may actually see in this picture right here, where we get to see Archaea orbiting around this imaginary point. We don't really know what this point is, but let's just assume for a second that it's actually L1 point right here, which means that on the other side, we have L2 point about 1.5 million kilometers away, and this is where we have the other objects. And these other objects are called Xanathar, which is technically orbiting this imaginary L2 point. Then we have Mara orbiting around Xanathar, and then we have Dibella orbiting around Mara. Now, this is obviously in a very perfect world, very perfectly theoretical world, where if these points were stable, this is exactly where these planets would stay, or I guess these moons would stay, because they're not technically planets anymore. And Nirn would obviously be in their center. And I think this, by itself, kind of warrants a pretty good explanation to the Dwemer Orrary scientifically. So if the Dwemer Orrary is actually correct, maybe this is how this world looks like. Maybe there is a Lagrange point where Archaea orbits. There's another Lagrange point where Xanathar, Mara, and Dibella orbit, and the other objects are technically moons of Nirn that are slightly farther away than Masser and its other moon Secunda. So I think this is actually what I wanted to try to recreate. Unfortunately, we also know that L1 and L2 points are not very stable, so within something like days, these objects will unfortunately fall out of their orbit and will most likely crash into each other, which is what we're going to observe right now as soon as I accelerate time. Let's actually see what happens if any of these objects actually remain in orbit, or if they all crash into each other. But I think what I wanted to do in this video is just to give you another idea of what or how you could recreate Elder Scrolls universe scientifically without using magic or without using mythology to explain it, and just to kind of make it make more sense, you know, in terms of science. And I think this is what Dwemer would actually appreciate as well, because Dwemer were known to be a very scientific species. Now, we have orbit changing here, and that's probably because something is happening here. Let's zoom into Xanathar. Let's see what happens here. Okay, well, these are actually still in stable orbit, but unfortunately Dibella acquired its own orbit. We're going to just accelerate time until we see collisions, and as soon as collisions start happening, we'll see what happens. Now, Archaea seems to be a little bit off on its L1 point, and I think Xanathar is also a little bit off, but they do have an orbit around the star, so they'll actually stay in a relatively constant orbit. But you can kind of see that things are actually not looking too bad. I mean, there is definitely a balance of some sort, even though we've lost our Secunda and only have Master left. But explaining this scientifically was actually quite a lot of challenge for me, because I needed to find another way, except for using black holes like I used in the previous video, to try to explain how it's possible to have these really strange, really unusual orbits, and how you can actually maintain balance and still have some sort of a scientific explanation, except for, of course, using magic and using other things to explain the Elder Scrolls world. And, okay, it looks like nothing is actually going to be colliding. Look at that. They're all sort of wobbling and moving around, but they are definitely in a relatively stable orbit, and I'm actually kind of happy. Archaea is a little bit behind, but that's okay. He might actually have a very large Lissajous orbit going on. And the other planets, which I guess are part of the Plains of Oblivion, are definitely in a very stable orbit around Magnus, and they'll actually stay there probably forever, because unless something really massive comes and disturbs them, they will be actually orbiting around the star indefinitely. And so this is what I wanted to create today, and this is the way I see the Elder Scrolls universe from the scientific perspective. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and hopefully you learn a little bit more about Lagrange points and how you can use them to essentially create really interesting worlds and really interesting universes and solar systems. And as you can see, both Archaea and Xanathar are still in the Lagrange point, and as I suspected, they actually have a very large Lissajous orbit, and they're basically orbiting around the imaginary point of L1 and L2. Anyway, so that's all I wanted to mention, and thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something from it. And if you did, don't forget to subscribe if you still haven't, and don't forget to like and share this video with your friends. Now, check out some of the other Universe Sandbox 2 videos, and also do watch the other 2 parts from the Elder Scrolls and Universe Sandbox videos that I've posted previously if you still haven't seen them, because there I did it a little bit differently. In one of the videos I used black holes, and in the other video I used the more Magnus-centric approach, where we actually focused on the idea of this being the center and everything else orbiting around it. Thank you for watching. I'll see you guys in the next video. Game you later, and as always, bye bye.